Welcome everyone. This class is this year we are slaves, next year we will be free. Every generation of Jews must see themselves as if they were slaves in Egypt, and God took them out with a mighty hand and with an outstretched arm. While it may be comforting to think that Egypt is long gone and pharaohs are a thing of the past, we would be foolish to believe this. The exodus from Egypt retains such great power in the Jewish imagination because its themes constantly make their presence known in the world and in our lives. These six classes, with today being the first, will seek to explore its key themes through a close reading of the biblical narrative and by drawing on midrash and traditional commentators alongside modern thinkers such as Sigmund Freud, Walter Benjamin, and Franz Rosenzweig. This class will be taught by Rabbi Zachary Truboff, who is the author of Torah Goes Forth from Zion, essays on the thought of Rav Kook and Rav Shagar, and is also the director of rabbinic education for the International Bet Din, where he teaches about halachic approaches used by the Bet Din to free agunot. Before making Aliyah, he served for nearly a decade as the rabbi of Cedar Sinai Synagogue in Cleveland, Ohio. Rabbi Truboff is originally from Sharon, Massachusetts, and now lives in Jerusalem with his wife Jen and their 4 children. With that, I'll turn this to you, Rabbi Truboff.
Thank you so much, Evie. It's an honor and a pleasure to be able to learn some Torah with you. Some of you I know, some of you I don't know. We have, I think, 6 classes that we'll be learning together. Part of what I'm excited about with this class is that, in a certain sense, themes or ideas that could seem more academic in maybe previous times are going to seem very relevant, as you'll see in just a few minutes. The part of what makes the Exodus story such a powerful and such a profound story is, as I mentioned, its enduring relevance, right? The fact that it's a story that you can read and see yourself in it, see your own circumstances within it. It has also served as a foundational text for the way that the West in particular has understood questions of oppression and liberation, questions of slavery and freedom. And part of what drew me to this particular narrative and looking at it in the way that we're going to, with a distinctly political lens, is because things in the world have gotten a little scarier than maybe what we knew from decades past, right? So my own interest in thinking about the Exodus through a political lens comes from the fact that over the last 7-8 years, there has been a significant increase in political instability, both in America and around the world. People will often say, or you'll see this in headlines, that democracy is in retreat. And I think for most of my life, questions of freedom, questions of, again, authority, government, good government, right? We take these things for granted. It's very easy to take these things for granted. It's only when things start to go wrong or start to get messy that you suddenly find yourself in a position where you have to ask very difficult questions that you may never have thought that you needed to ask before. Again, about what kind of society do we have? What makes freedom possible? What are the enemies of freedom? Right? These are the themes that, again, they come through every time you look at the Exodus story. Part of it, I think, is also important about the narrative, and this is something, again, that gives it a certain power, is that it is very easy as modern Jews to imagine ourselves as free, to imagine ourselves as liberated, to imagine ourselves as emancipated, right? Jews in the past, right, they lived oppression, right? They lived a certain form of slavery in a certain sense. We, however, are free. And on a simple level, there's a certain truth to that. But part of what we try to learn from the Exodus narrative, and this is made very, very clear at Passover, at the Seder itself, is that no matter how free we think we are never quite as free as we aspire to, right? The simple fact that we begin every Passover Seder when we get to the Magid section, right? We say these words, right? This year we are slaves, next year we will be free, right? And we don't just say that as some sort of imaginary idea. Like, we say those words because they are on a certain level true. As long as we live as Jews in a world of oppression, right? We are not free. Nobody is truly free. And we are yearning for a redeemed world in which that oppression will be overthrown. And in which, as we say, that next year we will actually truly, be free. And that is a reminder that no matter how free we are, we're never as free as we think we are. And sometimes the worse slavery is the slave who doesn't realize that they're a slave, right? And that is, again, part of the dynamics that we're going to be looking at in these sessions. My own thinking, again, about these questions, these political questions, philosophical questions, it comes from political theory, but also I would say you'll see a consistent theme in these sessions is a psychoanalytic understanding of these dynamics of slavery and freedom. That one of the things that seems very, very clear when you read the biblical narrative is that freedom is not just a question of whether or not you have chains on your arms, right? If that was true, then from the moment the Jews are liberated from slavery, from the moment they leave Egypt, we would see the Jews being free. But one of the things the Torah emphasizes again and again and again is that you can take the Jew out of Egypt, but it's not so easy to take the slavery out of the Jew, right? And that is true for all of us, that the dynamics of oppression are such that they don't, like I said, sort of live on our bodies. They also, those conditions live in our minds. And the narrative and the thinkers that we're going to be looking at very much recognize that oftentimes the greatest pharaohs, the greatest oppression that we have to overcome are the ones that we've like internalized at the end of the day. So that's a particular point that I want to highlight as well. Let me open up the slides. A second. So if I'll just note, if anybody's interested, I've actually published a collection of short essays that are going to touch on a lot of the themes that we're going to learn. The book is actually titled "This Year We're Slaves, Next Year We'll Be Free." So if you want, you can find that on Amazon. What we're going to be doing though is much more of a deep dive into a lot of these issues, whereas in the book I look at them a little bit more on a cursory level. But in this opening session, we're going to look at the process of enslavement as it takes place in the Exodus story. And I've titled this class Pharaoh's Racist Fantasy, because one of the things that is so striking when you read Exodus, those first chapter or two, is that the political dynamics that are present in the story seem like they are literally ripped from the headlines of what we know. And there's a dynamic that is at the heart of oppression that is going to be connected to this notion of fantasy, and particularly, as we'll see, a racist fantasy. So I'm going to come back to that theme in a little bit, but I want to just give you that as sort of the direction that we're going to be going in today. Just by way of introduction, I want to just give us a little bit more thinking about why, as Jews, these texts and these questions are of particular importance to us. And I want to do that through two Jewish thinkers, one who was not religious, though a very important political thinker, Hannah Arendt, and a rabbi, Rabbi Aaron Tamarat, who was very much a religious thinker, who often really tried to direct his energies towards political questions in a way that most other traditional Orthodox rabbis did not. So here's what Hannah Arendt says about the story of the Exodus. And again, Arendt did not have like a rich Jewish education. She's a political philosopher. She's thinking about political questions. She has some familiarity with Jewish sources, but nonetheless, she looks at the story of the Exodus as being of profound importance, particularly for Jews. And what she notes is Jews don't often realize how important the Exodus really is. So here's what she says. She says, as long as the Passover story does not teach the difference between freedom and slavery, as long as the Moses legend does not call to mind the eternal rebellion of the heart and mind against slavery, the oldest document of human history will remain dead and mute to no one more than the very people who wrote it. Right? What she's saying here is that when we look at the Exodus, when we experience the holiday of Passover, we have to see the questions that it raises as something that is alive and beating in our world right now. Right? Like, as I said, it's so easy to look at questions of freedom and slavery and think that they don't really apply to us, that they apply to other people in other places in other times. But what Arendt is trying to emphasize here is that if we look at this narrative as a dead narrative, we are missing something absolutely fundamental. And it's not just fundamental because we're Jews, it's fundamental to the political societies in which we live and the values that they have. She continues, she says, there is paradoxically a growing number of those who believe they must replace Moses and David with Washington or Napoleon, right? When it comes to Jews thinking about politics, there's a tendency to turn towards modern, what we might call secular thinkers, right? George Washington, Napoleon, and turn away from sort of classical Jewish figures like Moses and David. But she sees this as a profound problem, right? She says, ultimately, this attempt to forget our past and to find youth again, right? To find something new in modernity, like Washington and Napoleon, they're new thinkers, they're more exciting, they're more relevant, we might think. He says, at the expense of strangers will fail, simply because Washington's and Napoleon's heroes were named Moses and David. Right. So what Arendt is getting at here is that when it comes to questions of freedom and the way that we want to construct our societies, right, there's a tendency to look towards modern thinkers, newer thinkers, because we assume that they're the ones who really grappled with the issues that we know, right, the issues that we struggle with. But what we'd be missing is the way in which the Bible, the way in which the Torah story of the Exodus serves as the foundation to a large extent for all modern notions of freedom, and especially stories of emancipation. Right? What does it mean to be liberated from oppression? And if we were to look to the new and overlook the old, we would actually be missing what made the new possible. And one of the challenges that Jews have, particularly in modernity, is that modern Jews like modern things, modern thinkers, modern ideas. Modern Jews often have a challenge in recognizing that maybe the most important thing actually comes from the past. And that is the challenge that Arendt puts before us, that we got to look at this narrative and see it as important as any narrative, any text, any thinker that we might find when it comes to addressing, again, the most pressing, political questions that we face, that our society faces. Rabbi Tamarat gets at it in a little different way, but similar, right? That it's not just enough to look towards modern ideas of politics and of freedom, to a large extent because he recognizes that there's something about modern politics that hasn't achieved everything that it's really hoped for. Right. So here's what he says. He says, this is from an essay in 1906. And it's a very, very powerful essay, very, very long and detailed essay about questions of freedom and what is the relationship between the story of the Exodus and our modern sense of freedom. And here's what he says. He says, in actual practice, however, we discern certain differences in the means advocated by European nationalist parties for gaining freedom from those with which we gained our freedom. Meaning, when you look at modern notions of how groups of people achieve freedom, right, revolution is primary. And as he notes here, right, it was the nationalist revolutions in Europe, particularly in the 19th century, that led to creating what we think of as the modern liberal democracies of Europe. Now, his point is that the way the nationalist revolutions worked was not the way the Exodus worked, that they're two fundamentally different modes of achieving freedom. He says they seized their freedom at the time of the French Revolution, right, which is the first, sort of proto-nationalist revolution, for example, by means of barricades and bombs aimed at one desperate or another, right? The revolutions like the French Revolution or the revolutions of 1848 or the numerous nationalist revolutions in the 19th century, they were revolutions of violence, right? The oppressors were identified and violence was used to bring them down and to raise the people up. What he notes, however, about the Jewish Revolution, the Exodus, he says, we, on the other hand, strive to achieve our freedom through the enactments of the Seder, by eating matzah, reciting Hallel, each Jew participating in his own home within his family circle, which is to say that by recalling and reenacting the liberation from Egypt, we fan within our souls the divine flame of remembrance of God's merciful deeds. That what he says is that the Jews offer a different path than revolution, or you could say the Jews offer a different kind of revolution. Remember, as I said before, part of what the Exodus is emphasizing is that freedom is something that needs to be achieved up here as much as anywhere. And for Tamarat, the process of the Seder, the process of like reenacting and reflecting on the Exodus is a process of engaging in psychic liberation. And to a certain extent, what he thinks is that the liberation, the psychic liberation that the Exodus points us towards is as important, if not more, than the more material liberation that can be achieved by a physical revolution, right? That there's something that the Jews get in the way that we think about liberation, emancipation, and Exodus that, again, modern emancipation can often miss. He says, however, the strategy of these revolutions, the answering of evil with evil, meaning the modern secular political revolutions, is questionable. It may succeed, but on the other hand, it's just as likely to aggravate the original evil. right? One of the stories that one of the factors that we have to understand when we look at the last few centuries is that the attempt to achieve freedom oftentimes produces its opposite, right? That revolution can just as easily end in despotism, right? This is one of the fundamental messages of the French Revolution. What begins as a revolution of the people, by the people, for the people, a revolution that declares universal human rights, ends ultimately in the despotism of Napoleon, right? What begins with so much hope and optimism, so much excitement and transformation, ultimately ends in dictatorship, right? And that is often the case with revolution. The masters change, but new masters are ultimately put in place. And Rav Tamarit is very circumspect about this, that the attempt to achieve freedom, the attempt to overcome oppression, oftentimes reproduces it. And that is, to a large extent, because revolution doesn't address, again, sort of the deeper psychic components of it. He says here, even when it does succeed, it's only a short-lived palliative. This we have seen clearly in every land where freedom was seized forcibly by nationalist revolutions. In no time at all, the plague of despotism erupted in the flesh of the body politic, just as before. The only true cure for this despotism, the only remedy which removes the evil at its roots, is the revolutionary activity of the Jewish people, the enactment of the Seder, rightly understood, of course, and not merely performed by rote. That there's something about the Seder, there's something about learning, relearning, reenacting, re-experiencing the Exodus story that can move us towards freedom or grasping freedom in a way that, again, revolution or political processes of freedom can often miss. So we have to ask ourselves, like, what is it about the Exodus story that enables that? I mean, as much as I love Seders, everybody in my family knows how much I love to run the Seder, to participate in the Seder, but I don't necessarily view the Seder typically as a revolutionary act, right? Like if I'm going to engage be out on the barricades on a protest, right, fighting the good fight, right, there's something liberatory, there's something truly political about that. But a Seder is a religious act. So how is a Seder, which is a religious act, something I do with my family, ultimately moving us towards a deeper understanding or a deeper experience of true political freedom? And as I keep saying, this gets at the psychic dimension of the problem. Because what Rabbi Tamarat points out to us is that what we really learn when we look at the Exodus story, and this is something of profound importance, what we really learn from the Exodus story is the way in which oppression emerges. And more importantly, the way in which oppression is justified. What makes oppression so difficult to overcome is we don't even often realize the way that its tendrils reach into our thinking and reach into the way that we structure our societies. And until you can address the way that oppression is not merely a matter of who has the power or who has the force, but rather the way we think about ourselves in society as a whole, right? Until you can address the broader questions, you're not able to get at oppression's roots. And the Exodus, the Seder, actually enables us to get at oppression's roots. And what Tamarat actually describes here, he says that basically societies can engage in two kinds of evil, right? There's an evil that what he calls here a natural evil, which is just sort of like the Yetzer Hara. People do bad things. People, have, illicit desires and they act on them, and it causes, all sorts of problematic consequences, right? Because human beings are human beings. We fail, we sin, we desire things we shouldn't, we do things we shouldn't, right? That's just what it means to be human. It's part of what it means to be human. However, there's another kind of evil that humans engage in that isn't what he calls natural evil, right? He calls it here, he says, such is not the case, however, with what he calls unnatural evil, which is justified by the intellect and which is supported by the deception of the mind. In a word, this fraudulent evil, this evil justified by the mind, political evil, has become the greatest destroyer on the face of the earth. And what Tamarat's point is that human beings do bad things because they're human. But there's another problem, which is that human beings create ways of thinking, they create stories, they create systems of power that engage in bad things, and they are able to engage in bad things by telling people that they are good, right? Political evil is the evil that societies produce that justifies oppression. It's the story that societies tell themselves to explain why is it that Black people are supposed to be slaves? Why is it that Jews are supposed to, build the pyramids under the whip, right? That is what we might call ideological evil, right? And political evil, right? That is what we learn from the Exodus story, because Egypt was the kind of society that didn't just, do bad things. It did bad things through spinning a story of justification for them. He continues here. He says the intellectually embedded evil is its slippery justification at its side, had its inception in Egypt. Not until Egypt, the most advanced of ancient civilizations, do we have a clear instance of intellectual cunning operating to justify wickedness. The priceless phrase of Pharaoh, come, let us deal wisely with them, is the clue. Right, we're going to look at that verse in just a bit. That's what introduces Pharaoh's plan to enslave the Jews, right? Because what Egypt represents at its core, this is the way the Torah describes it, it calls Egypt a Beit Avadim, right? We often translate that as a house of bondage, a house of slavery. What does it mean to say Egypt is a house of bondage, a house of slavery? Well, what it means is that it's the kind of place in which a people can be selected out, and those people can be permanently designated as slaves. Those people can be permanently designated as deserving of oppression. What we see in Egypt is not just the birth of an unequal society, it's an unequal society in which that inequality is justified by the story that the society tells itself. And Egypt does it in a remarkably sophisticated fashion, right? That's what it means to be a house of bondage. All societies, to a certain extent, are unequal. What we might describe here, what Egypt brings to the table so clearly, is ideology, right? Ideology is the story societies tell itself to justify the suffering and oppression that takes place, right? All societies have these stories that it tells to justify the oppression, right? Because all societies are on a certain level unequal, right? Whether it's the rich and the poor, whether it's men or women, right? There's fundamental inequalities across all societies, but those inequalities could only exist if they were seen as legitimate in some way, right? That is what enables it's the story that is told to legitimize the oppression that makes these places so unequal. And it is exactly this kind of dynamic that makes Egypt the house of bondage, right? I'll just give you another example of this. This is from Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, a German Jewish thinker in the 19th century. He says, again, God famously redeems the Jewish people from the house of bondage, from Egypt. He says, the land of Egypt was for us a house of bondage, and in it we were slaves from birth. Right? Jews were enslaved for hundreds of years. So it very quickly reached a point in which to be born a Jew in Egypt meant to be born a slave, right? That was the natural state of Jews, right? To be slaves in Egypt. He says the negation of our freedom is brought about by the might of the Egyptian hand, caused it so that freedom was forgotten from the heart of all Jews. Slavery was considered to be our natural position, right? This is what I was talking about before, about ideology, about political evil, right? Political evil is when in a world in which human beings are all created in the image of God, all human beings are evil. Political evil is when you tell a story that somehow some human beings are less equal than others, that somehow some human beings are deserving of oppression and even slavery. That is their natural position, right? Egypt is the kind of place in which there are superiors and there are inferiors, right? And it tells a story to justify that. And what made it so pernicious for the Jewish people is that eventually it became the place in which Jews didn't even know they were supposed to be free, right? The thought was that the position of the Jew is to be subjugated as a slave, right? Which is to essentially have your humanity taken away from you. This same insight, ironically, is basically offered by Hannah Arendt as well in her great work, Origins of Totalitarianism. I just brought it because, again, it just shows you what is most pernicious about oppression is when you think it's the way things are supposed to be. She says here, slavery's crime against humanity did not begin when one people defeated and enslaved its enemies. As a matter, though, of course, that was bad enough, but when slavery became an institution in which some men were born free and others slaves, when it was forgotten that it was man who had deprived his fellow man of freedom, and when the sanction for the crime was attributed to nature. It's almost literally word for word Hirsch. I don't think for a moment she read Hirsch, but what they're both getting at is this fundamental nature in the way oppression becomes legitimated within societies, in which people think that it is normal and natural. And that is the great danger of Egypt, and that is the great danger of every society. And this is, we're going to keep hammering this right? We don't realize the extent to which oppression becomes normalized. And that is Egypt, right? And only when we start to grapple with how is it that oppression is sustained and perpetrated, can we even begin to grasp what it might mean to free ourselves from it. So the famous verses that we're going to be looking at that really are the crux of today's shiur are these verses from the first chapter of Exodus. We read it just a few weeks ago in Shul, in which the enslavement takes place. Again, these are verses we know, like you've all seen these before. We're going to look at them a bit closely, but there's no great chidushim, no great like novel things to be discovered, if only because we've seen them so many times. But in its familiarity, I do think there's something very, very important about them because they seem to describe a world that's not just from thousands of years ago, but one that we see around us, frequently, even sometimes in recent weeks. So the beginning of Exodus talks about the fact that Yaakov and his sons and his descendants have gone down to Egypt, right? They've gone down to Egypt. Why? Because Joseph was sold into slavery. And there was a great famine. And eventually Yaakov and his sons came down because there was food in Egypt. They reconnected with Joseph, and they chose to dwell there, to live there, the whole entire family. At some point, we're not told exactly how long afterwards, 50 years, 100 years, we are told that Yosef dies, all of his brothers die, that whole generation dies, and yet the Jewish people, their descendants, remain in Egypt. And they don't only just remain in Egypt, we're told here in verse 7, the Israelites were fertile and prolific. They multiplied and increased very greatly, so the land was filled with them, right? What happens to the Jews in Egypt? They start to multiply. There starts to become a lot of them. That's what we know, right? Then, of course, we get the famous line, Vayakom melech hadash al Mitzrayim, asher lo yadai Yosef. Then we're told that a new king, a new Pharaoh emerges, one who did not know Yosef. And of course, the reason that's significant is because Yosef was in many ways a great hero of Egypt, right? Yosef is the one who saved Egypt from famine. So for there to arise a Pharaoh who doesn't know Egypt, that means there is to arise a Pharaoh who doesn't know doesn't know Yosef means a Pharaoh that doesn't know what Yosef and essentially the Jews did for Egypt, right? We are now opening a new stage in history. This Pharaoh emerges and sees the Jews are multiplying. And here's what he says. He says to his people, this Pharaoh turns to the Egyptians. He says, look, the Israelite people are too numerous for us, right? The Jews are increasing, and that is a problem. That is a political problem for Egypt, as far as Pharaoh is concerned. He says, let us deal shrewdly with them so that they may not increase. Otherwise, in the event of war, they may join our enemies in fighting against us and rise from the ground. So what is Pharaoh saying here? Pharaoh is saying that as the Jews increase, they are a threat. They are an internal threat to Egypt because they're not Egyptian, right? They're different. They're stranger. They're other, and they're increasing. And they're an internal threat. This is his proposition, because if it ever happens that Egypt goes to war, there is a possibility that the Jews will be a fifth column, right? An enemy on the inside that will ally with Egypt's enemies against Egypt, right? That the Jewish presence in Egypt is potentially a great danger, a great trap for Egypt at some point in the future, and that we're told that Jews might join with Egyptians' enemies, and that they will ultimately rise from the ground. Now, it's not clear what that expression "rise from the ground" means. Va'ala min haaretz is the Hebrew. It's probably more, the reason that's a weird translation is because it probably means more along the lines of, and the Jews will leave Egypt. The reason that translation doesn't make sense, or we struggle with it, is why would Pharaoh's ultimate concern be that the Jews are going to leave Egypt, right? If he's so scared of the Jews, then he should be happy that they might end up leaving Egypt. Why do you want them around? They're a threat, right? So the simple fact that Pharaoh seems to be concerned the Jews will leave doesn't make sense with the first part of his verse, which is that he doesn't want them around because they're a danger in some way, right? So this, because of the danger presented by the Jews, that is what leads to their oppression. And then we're told they set taskmasters over the Jews to oppress them with forced labor, and they built garrison cities for Pharaoh, Pithom, and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they increased. Whatever you're doing to the Jews, no matter how much you oppress them, they're still multiplying. They're still having children, more and more children. And now we're told that it's not just that the Jews are a threat. It says that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. That in the Hebrew here, it's vayakutsu mipnei bnei Israel. That there's something about the Jews that is deeply off-putting, deeply upsetting, deeply uncanny to the Egyptians, that the Egyptians can't tolerate. We're told the Egyptians ruthlessly imposed upon the Israelites. Ruthlessly, they made life bitter for them with the harsh labor at mortar and bricks and with all sorts of tasks in the field. Right? The oppression begins. It is forced labor. Basically, the Egyptians are going to get people to build things for them, and the labor and the subjugation gets worse and worse and worse. We know it progresses towards genocide, which we'll pick up with at the end. But for our purposes, I really want to focus on what is the trigger for the oppression, right? And the trigger is initially raised as this fear, right? There's this foreigner amongst us that is a great threat to us. Now, this is an important idea. Number one, because throughout Jewish history, there have been many leaders like Pharaoh who said things like this about the Jews, right? What is so striking when you read these verses is how much they seem to reflect something of a universal human condition, at least a universal Jewish condition, that it is often the case that when the Jews are in a place, they are strangers, and those who are the masters of the land see the Jews as a potential threat. That is something that we know from the Jewish, from Jewish history, from the Jewish condition. But it is not just a Jewish dynamic, right? There are many political leaders today, some of them in very large countries, who often talk like this. There are foreigners, there are strangers that are potentially a threat to us and our way of life. And those foreigners, those strangers need to be dealt with. They need to be subjugated in a way that will ensure they will not be a danger to us in the future, right? This has been, again, the question of illegal immigration, both in America, particularly Arab migrants from the Middle East into Europe. This has been one of the great political problems of the last 15 years or so, that there are many, many politicians who get up and say things exactly like Pharaoh. That there is something that is not just universally Jewish about this dynamic, but there is something universally human about this dynamic. And this question of the other, the stranger, the illegal, the danger, the threat, what it becomes in this narrative is the license for oppression. The reason the Jews are oppressed is because there is this fantasy about them. And that's what I really want to focus on, as I titled this year, the racist fantasy. Where oppression is often rooted in societies is not, again, so much in just who is the powerful and how do the powerful oppress the weak, right? As I started with, it is about the stories that societies tell about themselves to explain or to justify why oppression is legitimate, right? And there is a very clear story, a very clear fantasy that Paro is getting at that is something that plays out in many societies, maybe all societies, that ultimately serves as the justification of oppression. That there is a group that is singled out, and there is a group that is seen as a threat, and there is and we have this constant political fantasy about this threat, and we mobilize politics. We mobilize people's energy around politics, around this question of who is the threat and how do we subjugate the threat. So I want to play out a bit what this means and where it comes from. This idea of the racist fantasy. Part of what we have to understand about ideology and the way that it sets up systems of oppression is that it often plays out on an unconscious level. That people don't necessarily oppress others because they wake up in the morning and they say, I want to be an evil person, right? People oppress others because there are often stories, narratives, ideas, and fantasies that are existing in the back of our mind without even always fully realizing it, that orient us in an oppressive manner towards other people, right? That there's something, what makes racism, what makes oppression a real live dynamic political force is the appeal that it has for us. That there's something about it we find appealing, that we're drawn to, even often without even realizing it. And that's what I want to get at with this this excerpt here. It's from Todd McGowan, a psychoanalytic thinker. He wrote a book called The Racist Fantasy, and he gets at something very fundamental about we as human beings. We as human beings all have fantasies, right? We typically think about fantasies as something individual and personal. But what McGowan gets at, and what psychoanalysis, what Freud certainly understood, is that fantasies are not just individual. They are also collective. that societies are bound together through their collective fantasies. What makes a person like an American is that they identify with the fantasy of America, right? So let me, even before we get into the text here, what is sort of the American fantasy, right? The American fantasy is the American dream, right? What does it mean to be an American? It means to be somebody who moves to America because you want a better life for yourselves, you want a better life for your children, right? You buy into the dream that if you work hard, right, you'll be able to achieve things. And if you work hard, you'll be able to go to college, you'll be able to get a good job, you'll be able to afford a house in the suburbs, you'll be able to have a white picket fence and 2 cars, right? That is the American dream. That is the American fantasy. And to a large part, what does it mean to be an American? It means to identify with that on a deep level, right? That what makes an immigrant sometimes to America more American than native born American is that immigrants identify so deeply with the fantasy of the American dream, right? They're willing to actually move from thousands of miles away because they believe in the American dream, right? That is that fantasy that actually makes you American to a certain extent. And one can offer the same thing about Israel, right? It is the Zionist fantasy, right? The idea that the Jews are returning to their homeland, that the Jews have their own state, that the Jews have the power to protect themselves, that the Jews have the power here to flourish in the face of their, whatever opposition there might be, right? That like to be Israeli means identifying with that fantasy, right? That these fantasies are very, very important for who we are, and particularly who we are as part of a collective. Those are sort of the positive fantasies, but there's a dark underside to those fantasies, which is what McGowan gets at. Because what he recognizes, this is a psychoanalytic point, is that we all have these fantasies and these collective fantasies, but fantasies can never fully achieve everything that they promise, right? The whole idea of a fantasy is that it promises something that to a certain extent is impossible, right? That's what makes it a fantasy, is that it's and not reality, is that it offers something amazing if only you can achieve it. But fantasies offer that promise that they present to us, that pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, isn't exactly quite real. Even though they're so important for, again, our identity and how we think about ourselves, they're never quite real. And because fantasies can't ever quite be made real, right? We know this in America. Not everybody can live the American dream, right? There's going to be rich and there's going to be poor. And today in America, it seems like even less and less can live the American dream, right? So what does that mean to be an American when the central fantasy that guides our identity is no longer possible? Well, this is something that psychoanalytic thinkers have understood for a long time, which is why that fantasies, for them to be something that are sustained, always require an obstacle. They always require something that threatens it, that's getting in the way, something that can be blamed as to why the full fantasy has not yet been able to be achieved. That's why wherever you find fantasies, political fantasies, you'll also find scapegoats for why those fantasies can't be achieved. And traditionally in America, but in most societies, right, what was needed was an other, some group, some subgroup that could be identified as the threat to the fantasy, right? And again, you see this in America very clearly right now. If the American dream is like becoming middle class, upper middle class, getting educated, getting a good job, right? That's no longer possible for so many Americans. So there must be an obstacle. There must be a group that threatens that fantasy, right? In an American political discourse, right, illegal immigrants are the obstacle to the fantasy of the American dream, right? If we could just get rid of all the immigrants, right, then everybody, all the proper Americans could live the American dream, right? That is the way politics functions. Every country has this. Israel has it too, right? What is if the Israeli, the Zionist fantasy is about power, it's about flourishing, it's about being in control, it's having nobody who can threaten us. Well, we know that Zionist, that Israel fantasy has many, obstacles or groups that can be identified as being the reason why we have yet to achieve it, right? Israel's ongoing conflict with the Palestinians in many ways represents the simple fact that the Palestinians are the opposition to the Zionist fantasy, right? There's always going to be that opposition because, as I said before, fantasies are never something that can be fully made possible, right? So they need an enemy, they need an obstacle, they need a scapegoat. And what McGowan points out here is that the groups that we identify as that enemy, as that obstacle, as that scapegoat, are often groups that are seen as being excessive or transgressive in some way. There's something about the group that makes them strange, different, other, right? That they're sort of go beyond the rules. They're able to do things that others can't, right? It's not just you pick any group and say, okay, they're the enemy, they're the scapegoat. What the group has to have is a characteristic that sees them as being beyond, sees them as being excessive, right? Being more than in some way. And in the context of the Exodus story, this is actually kind of clear. What's the detail that the Torah kept emphasizing about the Jews that makes them excessive, that makes them transgressive in a sense? Did anybody catch it? There was a repetitive word there. What is it about the Jews that seemingly is the thing that, like, more than anything is really getting under the Egyptian skin?
They kept multiplying.
Right? They kept multiplying. And again, there's something excessive about them, right? Rashi says here, I cited Vayishritzu, right, which is to multiply, but it almost has like an animalistic sense to it. He says, Shahayu yoldot shisha becheres echad, that a Jewish woman would give birth and she'd have 6 children, right? It's not that it's impossible to have 6 children, but that's not a normal thing for human beings. Right, so the Jews, I mean, this is a midrash, but what it's getting at is there's something excessive about the Jews. They're not evil. They're not enemies. They're not doing anything wrong, right? Jews have been loyal citizens of Egypt. Joseph helped. He saved Egypt. But there's something strange or extra or excessive about the Jews that makes them the threat for Egypt and for Egypt's fantasy. He says, let me just read a little bit of this. He says, what characterized the racist fantasy and differentiates it from other forms of fantasy is the obstacle to the object, right? That the racist fantasy isn't about the American dream, it's about the obstacle to the American dream. What bars the subject's access to unrestrained enjoyment is the racial other. We could have this amazing America, we can make America great again if we could just get rid of that group of people that is the problem. He says the fantasy's key player is the racial other because this figure makes the object unattainable. As the obstacle to complete enjoyment, the racial other is responsible for all the subjects in the society's failures. This figure gives the racist fantasy its racist hue. The fantasy defines the subject through the racial other that threatens it, which gives the subject a wholly secondary and insignificant status within the structure. The racial other bars the subject from enjoying the object by monopolizing the object for itself. Oftentimes, the racial other, they have the good thing that we want, but our fantasy isn't able to make possible. Right. So part of, like, again, using America, illegal immigrants are getting the American dream that native-born Americans are not getting. Right. Because the illegal immigrants are taking other people's jobs. Right. They're the ones who are getting the nice houses. Right. They're getting the enjoyment that that our fantasy is supposed to have for us. He says this other enjoys in the subject's stead, triggering resentment for the racial other. The fantasy always depicts the racial other's enjoyment as illegitimate, as a violation of the law of morality of social mores. The racial other becomes enshrined as racial, as being different, meaning that's what race is, a made-up thing. There's no way to tell really what makes one person one race or another, or how you determine the limit. Race is an arbitrary designation, but we treat it as something real, as a way of separating groups. He says the racial other always has an enjoyment advantage derived from its fantasized racial inheritance. It is a genetic gift like athletic ability or intelligence. Or in the Jewish case, the fact that they keep multiplying, they keep having children, right? Classically in America, Black people were the subject of America's racist fantasy. Black people were either, whoever is the object of the racist fantasy is always like a contradiction, right? So Black people were either lazier than everybody else or worked harder and were stronger than everybody else, right? Black people, especially Black men, were fantasized as having this extra sexual capacity that white men might not have. That Black men were going to get the white women. They're going to take away the white women from the white men, right? That there's something extra about them, right, that is going to prevent us from getting our fantasy, that makes them the threat in some way. So we have to now understand, what does this mean with regards to Egypt, right? What is Egypt's fantasy? I said what America's fantasy is, what Israelis, the Zionist fantasy. What is the Egyptian fantasy, and how are the Jews getting in the way of this? So I won't read it inside here, but Leon Kass summarizes quite nicely what is something very classic about Egypt. Right? The Egyptian fantasy is that it is a place that doesn't change. It is a society that is eternal. It is a society in which everything is in the balance, in which Pharaoh's role is to sort of unify heaven and earth. Right? There's a sense in Egypt that it has a place of permanence. It's not a society that changes. It's not a society that goes through revolutions. It's the way things are, or the way the things have always been. There's a cyclical nature to Egypt, right? This sense of eternal return, right? And complementarity. Everything is in balance. That is Egypt, right? Now, what we have to realize, of course, is that that is a fantasy, right? You can build the pyramids, which can last for thousands of years, but no society is permanent. No society is eternal. That's the fantasy, right? So for Egypt, right, the Jews' presence internal to Egypt represents the possibility that, again, remember we said before, fantasies are fantasies. You need an enemy, an obstacle, a scapegoat as to why the fantasy can't really happen. Because again, fantasies always promise the impossible. So you need an obstacle that tells you why the impossible might not be possible. And that's exactly what the Jews represent in Egypt, right? As long as the Jews are in Egypt, right, there is this threat to the eternal nature of Egyptian society, right? But in a certain sense, Egypt or Paro needs the Jews there, because as long as the Jews are there can be somebody to blame, or at least somebody to point to as to why is it that Egypt might not be eternal. Why might not Egypt be eternal, even though it thinks of itself as eternal, or it has the promise of eternity, right? Because the Jews are there, and the Jews might side with Egypt's enemies, right? Therefore, they are the obstacle to the Egyptian fantasy. They have to be oppressed, right? Just like the Black people in America, and just like, often a minority group in all of these, in all of the circumstances where there is, real political inequality. I'm not going to read all of these sources because we don't have a ton of time here. I'll just note that these ideas, this sort of way in which the psychoanalytic racist fantasy plays out, is something that you already start to see to a certain extent in Jewish sources. Hirsch, in his own commentary on this, argues that the oppression of the Jews was done to create sort of to build stability within Egyptian society, right? Because as long as the Jews could be oppressed, then everybody else who was subjugated to Paro didn't have to feel like they too were slaves, because the Jews were the real slaves, right? Even if most Egyptians were functionally slaves also to Pharaoh and to the aristocracy, right? So Hirsch is noting that having a group, identifying as a scapegoat, right, seeing them as the potential source of the problems, enabling them to be oppressed, builds, again, a certain stability and solidarity within a society. And it has often been the case the Jews were on the receiving end of that, right? Particularly in modernity, as nation states were being formed, right, by identifying the Jews as an enemy, right, societies were able to coalesce in a much more solid kind of way. Anti-Semitism was used to help build states, right, by finding an enemy that could unify the state, right, this internal enemy that ultimately would have to be expunged. W.E.B. Du Bois, famous Black thinker in America, he develops a concept known as the wages of whiteness, right? He addresses the question here, why is it that poor whites and poor Blacks in America wouldn't see themselves as being on the same team, right? Theoretically, they're both being oppressed by rich white people. So why wouldn't poor Blacks and poor white work together? And what he argues is that American racism was set up to a certain extent, right, to ensure that poor whites wouldn't rebel. Racism is always used to kind of build oppression in and keep it stable, right? Why is it that poor whites wouldn't want to join with Blacks to rebel? Because as long as the Blacks were seen as inferior, as long as they were oppressed, it gave the poor whites a certain compensation that could make them feel good about themselves. He says here, it must be remembered that the white group of laborers, while they received a low wage, were compensated in part by a sort of public and psychological wage. They were given public deference and titles of courtesy because they were white, right? It's referred to as the wages of whiteness, right? That to have an oppressed group means that other groups who are also oppressed, as long as they can see themselves as superior to the oppressed group, it keeps them in line too, right? It keeps, the real oppressors ultimately in charge without having to worry that either the poor whites or the poor Blacks, so to speak, will rebel against them, right? And this is the kind of society that is ultimately being generated in Egypt. And it is the kind of society that we see always, all around us. One of the interesting points is that, remember I said before that Paro's great fear was that the Jews were going to leave Egypt, which didn't make sense because the whole concern was that they're going to be a threat internal to Egypt. So why would you be afraid they're going to leave Egypt? So Rashi cites from the midrash and says something very, very interesting, which gets at the way in which, again, the racial fantasy is like an unconscious fantasy, right? We don't often realize that we're scapegoating, right? That's the thing. We think that people scapegoat and they do it consciously. It is often done unconsciously. We see people as a threat and we really think they're a threat, right? Anti-Semites really think Jews are a threat. they don't realize how absurd it is, right? That they're projecting this onto Jews. So here, what Rashi notes, he says here, is that when Paro spoke and said he was concerned about the Jews leaving, he misspoke, right? In a certain sense, it was like a Freudian slip. He said more than he meant, right? That's the idea about Freudian slips, is you kind of speak your unconscious. You say things that you know that you don't even realize that you know, things that you think or want, and you don't even realize you think or want them. In this particular case, what essentially Paro is getting at is his greatest fear is that Jews are going to leave Egypt. Because the greatest fear of every racist politician is that you're going to lose what at the end of the day, right? Your greatest fear is you're going to lose your scapegoat, right? Because the scapegoat is what holds society together, what holds the people on top of the people on the bottom, right? So what Paro is most worried about is that he sees an opportunity with the Jews to build his Beit Avadim, right? This perfect, enduring, eternal society in which there's still a permanent enemy, right? The permanent potential obstacle, right? The Jews who we have to subjugate. And of course, by subjugating them, by enslaving them, he's able to use them to the benefit of Egypt, right? He builds his monuments to Egypt's permanence, the pyramids, through slave labor, right? That's the only way he can get his eternity, is by enslaving human beings and turning them into something less than human, right? That's the only way he can achieve, or even give an attempt to achieve his particular fantasy. The last point I want to get to here, and this is something I hope that we don't have to see in our lifetimes, but I worry because as the racial fantasy manifests more and more in politics and the oppression that emerge from it, you also get the rise in violence. But the racial fantasy is often deeply tied to the emergence of violence. It's not enough just to oppress the racial other, that excessive other, right, who's potentially a threat, who's transgressive in some way, who's doing the things that we're not getting to do, that inevitably there emerges violence against them as well. And it's not always violence from the top of the state, right? Sometimes the greatest violence you have to worry about, we worry so much about state systematic violence, but oftentimes the worst kinds of violence is the violence that emerges not from the top in states, but from the bottom, like from the people itself. And if you know anything about, again, the condition of African Americans, particularly in the early 19th or early 20th, late 19th century, right, violence was an ever-present reality. And yes, there was police violence, there was state violence, but oftentimes the most threatening violence came from essentially their neighbors, right? White neighbors in the South would engage in lynching, right? And lynching was this moment in which you identified, the scapegoat, the enemy, and you engaged in dramatic violence towards them. And of course, one of the things we have to keep in mind with lynching is that it has this very complicated relationship with authority, right? In that it kind of comes from both the top and the bottom at the same time. Let me just read you a little bit about this. This again, Todd McGowan. He says, the practice of lynching is perhaps the most extreme response to the racial fantasy, and particularly the racial other. Lynching was an extra-legal practice occurring primarily in the American South in the 70 years following the Civil War that functioned as a compensation for the inadequacy of legal authorities in the face of the threat of Black enjoyment. Why you have to lynch Black people? Because Black people are enjoying. They're getting that excessiveness. They're being excessive. They're getting those things that white people, think that they're supposed to be for them. And it's the act of violence towards them that does two things. It limits their enjoyment. They're not going to get it any longer. And also, more importantly, you get enjoyment through the act of violence itself, right? If you know anything about lynchings, historically, they were like social gatherings. Like people would come together. It was exciting, right? It was almost had like an erotic energy to it, right? There's something about violence towards that excessive racial other that the human beings are often deeply attracted to. Right? It says here, lynching most often targeted Black men who engaged with white women in some measure of a sexual relationship, from acts as innocent as a desiring land to accusations of rape. Lynching provided a means through which the perpetrators could themselves partake in this illicit enjoyment. Right? I'm going to get this extra enjoyment through the violence towards this other who threatens my fantasy. Although we imagine lynching as a hidden activity done under the cover of night by masked men, it was first and foremost a quasi-public ritual, whereby racist white society partook of the Black enjoyment that threatened it. In the American racist fantasy, Black enjoyment hindered any realization of white desire. The fantasy envisioned the Black man doing what the white man refrained from doing, enjoying women without the constraints of marriage or propriety. the black man enjoyed in the stead of the white man, and did so in a way that white man could not. That's the fantasy. The black man is able to have sexual satisfaction enjoyment that the white man cannot. Therefore, the black man needs to be killed. And again, in the Exodus story, we see this. What do the Jews have? They have this excessive capacity that they keep multiplying. And even when you try to oppress them, somehow they just keep, it's like, people, if you're familiar with Magician's Apprentice, right, the Disney movie. So there's a moment in it where Mickey is like chopping up the magic broomstick, right? And every time he chops up one of the magic broomsticks, it keeps like multiplying, right? There's more and more and more of them, right? There's a sense of that with the Jews. Like somehow they're able to like survive this oppression and show that they're like more than it or stronger than it in a way that Egyptians themselves clearly are not, right? And that is so triggering for the Egyptians. He says this black enjoyment was also the means through which the fantasy produced enjoyment for whites. White lynching is an act of barbaric violence. It reveals how the racial other's enjoyment served as the source of enjoyment for the vested in the racial fantasy. Or that the act of violence becomes a way of enjoying as well, right? The black man is a threat to the white man's enjoyment, right? That's why they have to be subjugated, but it's not enough to subjugate them. The white man also gets enjoyment by enacting this violence against them. And that is what we see actually in Egypt. This is actually something that the Ramban Nachmanides brings up in his commentary, and I'll end with this. He sees violence emerging, and it's not just the state violence. It's not just Pharaoh and his soldiers enslaving the Jews, that there is violence that emerges from the Egyptian people as a whole, something that Pharaoh himself inspires, right? Oftentimes, when it comes to this kind of racial violence, there's like a wink, wink, nod, nod between the racial politician and the people that are inspired to violence by them. And that is what Ramban actually sees happening here in the story. He opens again the famous verse, "Come, let us deal wisely with the people," right? We have to come up with a way of convincing people that this oppression of the Jews is justified, right? Pharaoh, and again, part of what I'll note is this whole fantasy of the Jews is based on the fact that Jews are going to be disloyal, right? What's so strange about that fantasy is if there's ever been a people that demonstrated their loyalty, so to speak, even as strangers, it would be the Jews, because Joseph was the one who saved Egypt, right? Joseph is the one who did everything he could to make Egypt this great and strong place, right? The Jews feel gratitude to Egypt, right? Egypt helped save them in the time of famine. Why would you expect the Jews to be the ones who are going to turn on Egypt, right? That's the thing about the racial fantasy. It's not based in logic. It's simply based on this sort of unconscious reaction that we have to an other that we see as excessive in some way, and therefore as potentially getting in the way of the things that we want for ourselves. It's not justified. It's never justified. He says, Pharaoh and his wise counselors did not see fit to slay them by the sword, to go right it by killing the Jews. That was not the first step, just to go kill them. It was not genocide right away. For it had been a gross treachery to smite without reason a people that had come into the land by a command of a former king, right? The Egyptian people would not have got up and helped Pharaoh kill all the Jews right away, right? Because it wouldn't have made sense. The Egyptians are not brutal. They're not evil. They're not going to just turn on this group of people that have been in Egypt for centuries. The people of Egypt also would not give Pharaoh consent to commit such perfidy, since he took counsel with them, and all the more so since the children of Israel were a numerous and mighty people and could wage war against them, right? Egyptians were going to rise up and start killing the Jews because there's also a lot of Jews. It would have meant civil war. It was not going to start with mass genocide. It never starts right away with genocide. I think we all know this. Rather, Pharaoh said he would do it wisely, so the Israelites would not feel it was done in enmity against them. Right? There's a progression that takes place here with the racial fantasy and the oppression that it unfolds. But it doesn't happen all at once. Step after step after step. It is for this reason that he placed a levy upon them, as it was customary that strangers in a country contribute a levy to the king, as is mentioned in the case of King Solomon. Right? The Jews are not initially slaves, they're subjugated labor, they're conscripted labor, right? Because the custom was that foreigners could be conscripted as laborers in the countries in which they resided, right? We see that with King Solomon. He conscripts foreigners who are living in Israel. That's the first step, right? It can be kind of justified. It's the way things are done. It's not great, but it's still, that's way things are done at times. But again, the oppression progresses here, the racial fantasy progresses. He says, afterwards, he secretly commands the midwives to kill the male children upon the birth stool so that even the mothers should know it, right? The next step, again, is not systematic genocide. It's like hidden genocide, right? He's going to turn to the midwives and they're going to kill the Jewish babies, the Jewish boys, right? But it's not out in public. Paro is not yet making a declaration. It's time. He hasn't written his Mein Kampf yet. He's not just said we need to kill all the Jews, right? It's a slow progression of the racial fantasy. And then he continues here. He says, following that, this is now the next step, right? He charged all his people, saying that every son that is born yourselves shall cast into the river. Every boy, even every Egyptian boy as well, but at least every Jewish boy should be killed and thrown in the Nile. Essentially, Pharaoh did not want to charge his executioners to slay them by the decree of the king or to cast them into the river. But when Pharaoh says every Jewish boy should be thrown in the river, he doesn't mean that he's going to send his guards and do it, right? He's saying it as a general declaration, right? For it to be followed through on, the Egyptian people themselves are going to have to rise up and take the Jewish boys and throw them into the Nile. Rather, he said to the people that whoever would find a Jewish child should throw him into the river. Should the child's father complain to the king or to the master of the city, they would tell him to bring witnesses and they will exact vengeance. Meaning Paro does not come up with a state system and a group of laws that say you got to throw every Jew in the Nile, right? He's sort of inspiring people to do it. It's not the law, but people kind of get the message from Paro that this is the way things are going, that these people are dangerous, and therefore people are going to take their own initiative, following Paro's inspiration, and kind of act on it. And at the end of the day, like all racist politicians, Paro will have plausible deniability. I didn't tell them they had to do it, right? Let them bring proof, right? It's still murder, even as Paro is clearly sort of giving the implicit message that that's the violence that should take place. And then it goes on, he says, now once the king's restrictions were removed, the Egyptians would search the houses, enter them at night, and indifferent to the cries of the parents, would remove the children therein. The next step is it's not just if the Egyptians sees a Jewish boy, they'll throw him in the Nile. Now they're going into people's homes. Now they're pulling people out of their homes in order to get them. And it is therefore said, and then she can no longer hide him. Meaning the moment when Yocheved can no longer hide Moshe, it's not just because he's going to cry out and the Egyptians will hear him. It's because Egyptians are searching Jewish homes for Jewish baby boys so that they can throw them in the Nile, right? We have full-on lynchings, full-on lynch parties, so to speak, playing out in Egypt. So I think it's very interesting. It's disturbing, but very interesting what Ramban lays out here, because he recognizes, A, the way the racist fantasy is often tied to violence, how that violence is not top-down, imposed by the state, but often inspired by those at the top, and those at the bottom take up that call, that imperative, as a form of enjoyment. Right? We got to get rid of the Jews because they're dangerous, but there's a lot of fun in being able to get rid of the Jews. Right? Like that's the fundamental danger that's presented here. So unfortunately, today's shiur is not going to end on a positive note, to a large extent because the Exodus story begins with oppression. And part of the challenge of the story is really sitting with that oppression, right? Really sitting with these internal dynamics that we kind of know all too well, and recognizing what they are and where they can go, and realizing that it doesn't happen all at once, and B, the way oppression lives in the unconscious fantasies that societies perpetrate, and recognizing how easy it is to become susceptible to them, right? People aren't racist, like I said, because they wake up in the morning and say, I want to be evil, right? These ideas live in our unconscious in ways that can be very difficult for us even to fully reconcile with. Hopefully next week we'll start to pick up a little bit closer towards the liberation or the emancipation. But this is, again, when you look at Exodus, you see the headlines, and that's been the case forever, and it's especially the case right now. And that is something we have to, take very, very seriously. Let me end here, and if there's any questions or two for a few minutes, I'm happy to address them.
Brilliant lecture, Rabbi. Every word.
Sorry, Sherry, I just didn't hear you.
Brilliant lecture. Every single word was so on point and so exhilarating to make me want to look back at the text, and also just strengthening because of all the horrible things that you point out. But we have we have a text to go by and to guide us. Really,
and
amazing.
what that text is doing is showing us that these dynamics are real and that they're a problem. Because again, the biggest issue is these dynamics happen and we actually think they're normal, that they're actually the way things are, right? That they are the enemy. There is this threat. There is this group that is undermining, that is getting in the way of the fantasy that we have for our societies. Right? That is a natural place to be in. But what this text reminds us is that when we start to see that dynamic, and we all engage in it, right? Like on some level or another. That like, no, that's immediately a sign that there's a deeper problem playing out.
Yeah.
Again, it's the most effective form of politics because I mean, we talk about this, like fear motivates people, right? Like that there's somebody who's going to get in the way of the thing that I want more than anything. That motivates us, and particularly in democratic politics, where you need to motivate people to go to the polls, right? Like the racist fantasy becomes a very powerful tool.
Oh, absolutely. And I don't want to take it too much into more of America because it's just so deeply worrisome and depressing. But it was fantastic, your insights as to why even the thing that the Pharaohs said, they're just so numerous. And as you said, why not get rid of them then? But the psychological dynamic of he had to hang on to them. That was tremendous.
Right.
Fantastic.
Right. Yeah. Sigrid, is it?
Yeah. Could you send the text that you showed on screen?
Sure. Yeah, I'll send
way
it to
to-
Grisha, and then they'll send it out with the next year, so you'll get both source sheets. You'll get this week and then next week together.
Okay, great.
And could we get also
and
a
I would-
copy of the recording? Sorry.
They usually Drisha will post it eventually. I don't know exactly when.
And will you be focusing more on Jewish sources?
I go back and forth, so it's like half
Okay.
and half.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you so much, Rabbi Truboff.
Thank you.
Of course, to everyone who is always part of our learning community here at Drisha. Just a quick reminder that Springsman is underway. We have many more classes. You can sign up for them or find information at drisha.org/classes. And for now, lehitraot.